Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. It is a quiet comfort to have you with us again as we descend into the shadowed archives of human history. The word family evokes a sense of warmth, of sanctuary, a circle of trust where we are meant to be safest. But history whispers darker truths. It tells of bloodlines where this sacred bond was not a shield, but a weapon, where the family unit became a hunting pack and the home a meticulously crafted trap. Tonight, we explore the most terrifying family trees, where violence was the inheritance and murder the family business. We begin with a family that turned prairie hospitality into a prelude to the grave. Case 1. The Bloody Benders Family. Our story begins in the vast, windswept expanse of Labette County, Kansas, in the year 1870. This was the American frontier, a landscape of immense promise and equally immense peril. The Civil War had ended just 5 years prior, and the nation was still healing, still expanding. The Homestead Act had drawn settlers westward, each carrying a dream of land and a new beginning. They traveled along rough-hewn trails, one of the most prominent being the Osage Trail, a vital artery that pulsed with the lifeblood of this westward migration. It was a path for families in covered wagons, for lone prospectors with gold in their eyes, for discharged soldiers seeking peace, and for land speculators looking for their fortune. These travelers were vulnerable. They were often far from the reach of established law, isolated by miles of untamed prairie. A friendly face, a warm meal, and a sturdy roof for the night were not just comforts. They were necessities for survival. It was in this environment, a perfect intersection of hope and danger, that a family arrived and staked their claim on a 160-acre plot of land right beside the busy trail. They were known as the Benders. To the outside world, they were a curious but seemingly unremarkable family of German immigrants. There was the patriarch, John Bender Sr., a man in his 60s, tall and imposing with a stern, guttural voice that many found unsettling. He spoke little English, his words often coming out as guttural grunts, making communication difficult and adding to his intimidating presence. His wife, Elvira, was a stout woman in her late 50s. Neighbors described her as unfriendly, a she-devil, whose piercing eyes seemed to watch everything and everyone with a silent, unnerving judgment. She was often seen tending a small vegetable garden and orchard, a picture of domesticity that belied the darkness within. Then there were the children. John Bender Jr., a man in his mid-20s, was handsome in a rough, rustic way. He was socially awkward, prone to strange, sudden laughter for no apparent reason, which made many people uncomfortable. He shared his father's stoicism but lacked his intimidating aura, replaced instead by an air of unpredictable oddness. And finally, there was Kate Bender. At 23, she was the face of the family, the element that drew people in. She was attractive, vivacious, and fluent in English. Kate was the family's public relations, their charismatic lure. She proclaimed herself a spiritualist, a healer, and a clairvoyant, capable of communicating with the dead and curing ailments. In an era fascinated by spiritualism and seances, her claims were not as outlandish as they might seem today. She advertised her services, and her charm, combined with her professed supernatural abilities, made her a local celebrity of sorts. It was Kate who made the Bender homestead a place people sought out, not just for lodging, but for curiosity and perhaps a glimpse into the great beyond. Their home was as peculiar as the family itself. It was a simple one-room timber cabin, measuring about 16 by 24 feet. But it was ingeniously designed for a purpose far more sinister than providing shelter. The single room was divided in two by a large canvas wagon cover, hung like a curtain. The front portion served as a small general store and an inn. It contained a makeshift counter where they sold dry goods, a simple dining table, and a few stools. This was the public space where travelers were welcomed. The back portion, behind the curtain, was the family's private living quarters. This simple canvas sheet was the boundary between a welcoming inn and an abattoir. Unseen by any guest, a crucial feature was built into the cabin's floor, right beside the dividing curtain. It was a trapdoor, covered by a rug, leading down into a dark, stone-lined cellar. The cellar was 6 feet deep, its earthen floor cold and damp. This was not a root cellar for preserving food. It was a temporary tomb. The Bender's method was a model of predatory efficiency, a well-rehearsed play performed for an audience of one. A weary traveler, often alone and carrying cash or valuable possessions, would be invited in for a meal. They would be treated with a calculated hospitality, offered a seat at the table. This seat, the seat of honor, was always positioned in the same place, with the guests back to the heavy canvas curtain. It was the most vulnerable position in the room. As the guest ate, Kate would engage them. She would use her charm, her wit, and her captivating stories to hold their complete attention. Perhaps she would offer to read their fortune or contact a departed loved one. All eyes would be on her. The traveler, feeling safe and entertained, would be completely oblivious to the silent threat materializing just inches behind their head. From behind the curtain, either Pa Bender or John Jr. would approach, moving without a sound. In their hand, they held a heavy sledgehammer. With the victim distracted by Kate, the attacker would deliver a single, crushing blow to the back of the skull. The attack was swift, silent, and brutally final. There was rarely a struggle, often not even a cry. The moment the victim slumped forward, the trapdoor beneath them was thrown open. The body was unceremoniously dropped into the dark, 6-foot-deep cellar. Down in the darkness, if the hammer blow had not been fatal, a knife would be drawn across their throat to finish the job. They were then stripped of every last valuable. Cash, watches, horses, wagons, even the clothes on their backs. The profit from each life was meticulously collected. Later, under the cover of night, the bodies would be removed from the cellar. Pa and John Jr. would carry the grim burdens out to the seemingly peaceful vegetable garden and the young apple orchard behind the cabin. There, in the soft, tilled soil, they would dig shallow graves and bury the evidence of their horrific work. The apple trees, a symbol of life and sustenance, were nourished by death. For nearly 2 years, from the spring of 1871 to the winter of 1872, people vanished along the Osage Trail. A lone man on a horse, a father and daughter traveling together, a prospector heading home, they would be seen passing through the area, and then they would simply cease to exist. In the vastness of the frontier, disappearances were not uncommon. People moved on, changed plans, or fell victim to the natural dangers of the wilderness. For a time, no one connected these scattered disappearances to the strange German family running the small wayside inn. But the number of missing persons grew too large to ignore. Rumors began to circulate. The area around the Bender property was developing a dark reputation. Local residents started to talk, sharing stories of people who had last been seen heading towards the Bender place. In the winter of 1872, the disappearance of a man named George Lawnshare and his young daughter brought the simmering anxieties to a boil. Lawnshare had left the nearby town of Independence to resettle in Iowa, but he and his child never arrived. They had vanished into thin air. The tipping point, however, came in the early spring of 1873 with the disappearance of a well-respected physician named Dr. William York. Dr. York was returning home to Independence after visiting his brother in Fort Scott. He was a prominent man from a powerful family, and his disappearance would not go unnoticed. His brother was Colonel Alexander York, a lawyer, a Civil War veteran, and a Kansas state senator. Colonel York was not a man to let his brother's disappearance go unanswered. He arrived in Labette County with the full force of his influence and a relentless determination to find out what had happened. He began a systematic search, questioning everyone along the Osage Trail. His investigation inevitably led him to the Bender Inn. Colonel York, accompanied by a small party, visited the Benders in late March. He asked them if they had seen his brother. The Benders admitted that Dr. York had stopped at their inn for a meal. They claimed he had continued on his way, unharmed. During the questioning, Colonel York found their behavior suspicious. Kate allegedly became flirtatious, then subtly threatening, suggesting she could use her clairvoyant powers to help him find his brother for a price. She even hinted that she knew his brother was dead, but that he had been killed by someone else. Pa and John Jr. remained silent and menacing. Elvira stared at the visitors with undisguised hostility. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken menace. Though he had no proof, Colonel York left the Bender property convinced they were involved. His suspicions galvanized the local community. A meeting was called at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse, a small building not far from the Benders' land. The purpose was to organize a formal search party for all the missing people. Nearly 75 men from the surrounding area attended, including Pa Bender and John Jr. The presence of the two Bender men at the meeting was a display of chilling audacity. As the attendees discussed the growing number of disappearances and planned to search every homestead along the trail, a grim consensus formed. The culprits were likely among them. The plan was agreed upon. They would start the search the next day. During the meeting, Pa Bender reportedly sat stone-faced, unable to understand most of the English conversation, but clearly sensing the shift in mood. John Jr., true to his nature, sat with a nervous, inappropriate smile on his face. Colonel York noticed their unease and the palpable tension they created in the room. The Benders knew the net was closing. They knew that a search of their property would be their undoing. They did not wait for it. That very night, under the cloak of a storm that swept across the prairie, the entire Bender family vanished. A few days later, a neighbor who was driving cattle past the Bender property noticed that it was eerily quiet. The animals in their pen were thin and distressed, clearly having not been fed for days. The inn was shuttered. Sensing something was wrong, he alerted the authorities. A search party, led by Colonel York, was quickly dispatched. When they arrived, they found the cabin completely abandoned. It was as if the family had been spirited away. Inside, they found a few meager belongings, some clothes and prayer books. But they also found something else. A foul, sweetish odor of decay hung heavy in the air, a smell that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. The investigators' attention was drawn to the trapdoor in the cellar. Prying it open, they were met with a wave of stench so overwhelming that it drove them back. The cellar was empty, save for caked blood and the lingering smell of death. The blood had seeped into the earthen floor, a permanent stain of the horrors that had occurred there. The search then moved outside, to the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and the apple orchard. Colonel York, driven by a desperate hope of finding his brother, ordered his men to start probing the ground with metal rods. It did not take long. In a patch of soft earth near an apple tree, a probe struck something solid. They began to dig. What they unearthed was the beginning of a nightmare that would brand the family with the name Bloody Benders for all time. The first body they pulled from the shallow grave was that of Dr. William York. His skull was crushed, and his throat had been cut. The discovery confirmed Colonel York's worst fears, but it was only the start. The men continued to probe and dig, turning the once peaceful orchard into a field of horrors. One by one, the victims were exhumed. They found the body of Mr. Longshare, and then, in a separate, even shallower grave, the body of his little girl. She had been buried with him, but it appeared she may have been buried alive, as there were no visible injuries on her tiny body, only the horror of suffocation. The sight broke even the most hardened men in the search party. They found the bodies of men, women, and at least one other child. Some were so decomposed they were unidentifiable. Every adult victim had the same injuries: a massive head trauma from a hammer and a slit throat. The search party worked for days, turning over the entire acre of cultivated land. In total, they unearthed at least 11 bodies, though many believed the true number was closer to 20. The apple orchard had become a mass grave, a place the locals would soon call Hell's Half-Acre. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Crowds flocked to the Bender property, a morbid pilgrimage to witness the scene of the crimes. The cabin was torn apart by souvenir hunters, each person taking a piece of the blood-stained wood or a brick from the chimney, tangible mementos of an unimaginable evil. But what of the Benders themselves? A massive manhunt was launched. Posses were formed, and rewards were offered for their capture, dead or alive. The trail led to the nearby town of Thayer, where the Benders had apparently purchased train tickets. It seemed they had split up, heading in different directions. But beyond that, the trail went cold. The Benders, a family of 4 who had operated with such brutal efficiency, had managed to disappear as effectively as their victims. Their fate remains one of the great, enduring mysteries of American true crime. Numerous theories have been proposed over the decades. One popular theory, widely believed by the locals at the time, is that a vigilante posse caught up with the family and enacted their own frontier justice, killing them and burying their bodies where they would never be found. Some claim to be part of such a posse, but their stories were often contradictory and could never be verified. Another theory is that they simply got away. With the money they had stolen, they could have easily created new identities and assimilated into other frontier towns, their dark past buried as deeply as their victims. Over the years, several people were arrested on suspicion of being one of the Benders. An older woman named Almira Monroe was accused of being Elvira Bender, and another named Sarah Eliza Davis was accused of being Kate. Both were eventually released due to a lack of evidence. The mystery of their escape became as much a part of their legend as their crimes. The legacy of the Bloody Benders is not just in the number of their victims, but in the profound way they perverted the fundamental tenets of society. They turned hospitality into a weapon and the family home into a slaughterhouse. They were not driven by some frenzied, passionate rage. Theirs was a cold, pragmatic, and businesslike approach to murder. They were predators who built their own hunting blind on the open prairie and preyed on the universal human need for shelter and kindness. The story of the Benders serves as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not always the ones that lurk in the shadows, but sometimes the ones who invite you in, offer you a warm meal, and smile at you, just before they erase you from the world. The travelers who stopped at their inn were searching for a new life, a new future. Instead, they found an unmarked grave, their dreams buried beneath the roots of an apple tree in a quiet corner of Kansas, their stories ending in a dark cellar behind a canvas curtain. Case 2. The Harp Brothers, America's first serial killers. If the Benders represented a perversion of domesticity, a corruption of the home, our next story takes us to a place where the concept of home was never a sanctuary to begin with. We move back in time to the raw, violent, and unforgiving American frontier of the late 18th century. This was a land barely etched with the lines of civilization, a place where law was a distant rumor and survival was a daily battle. It was in this crucible of chaos that a different kind of family evil was forged, not the quiet, methodical predation of the Benders, but a blood-soaked rampage fueled by a seemingly bottomless well of rage and nihilism. This is the story of Makaja and Wiley Harp, men often cited as America's first serial killers. Their very origins are shrouded in the mists of violence and rebellion. Makaja, known as Big Harp due to his immense, brutish frame, and Wiley, his smaller but equally malevolent counterpart known as Little Harp, were not brothers by blood. They were cousins, born in what is now North Carolina to Scottish parents who were staunch loyalists to the British Crown. They came of age during the American Revolution, a conflict that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The Harps, however, seemed to have no allegiance to any cause but their own violent impulses. They were said to have fought alongside loyalist militias, but their actions were less those of soldiers and more those of marauders. They participated in raids, not for king and country, but for the thrill of terror, torture, and plunder. They were part of rape gangs that roamed the countryside, their brutality making them outcasts even among the desperate and the lawless. When the war ended and America was born, the Harps found themselves on the losing side, filled with a festering resentment for the new nation and everyone in it. They were men without a country, without a creed, save for a profound and abiding hatred for humanity. They fled westward, into the untamed wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, a land that mirrored the wildness in their own souls. And they were not alone. They brought with them their family, a twisted mockery of a domestic unit. With them were 2 sisters, Susanna and Betsy Roberts. Makaja had claimed Susanna as his wife, and Wiley had taken Betsy. It is unlikely these were unions of consent. They were unions of coercion and fear. The women were captives, slaves to the Harps' whims, forced to bear their children and witness their atrocities. This was not a family built on love or mutual support. It was a traveling fiefdom of terror, with Big and Little Harp as its absolute tyrannical rulers. Their journey of blood began in earnest around 1797. They left North Carolina and moved into Tennessee, near Knoxville. Here, their legend began to take shape, written in the blood of the innocent. Their method was devoid of the bender's cunning or subtlety. The Harps were engines of pure, blunt force. They would ambush travelers on the lonely frontier trails, like the infamous Wilderness Road. Their attacks were sudden, overwhelming, and horrifically violent. They would bludgeon their victims with a tomahawk, stab them with a long knife, or simply beat them to death with their bare hands. Their motive was often puzzling. While they did rob their victims, the paltry sums they acquired seemed secondary to the act of killing itself. They killed with a ferocity that went far beyond what was necessary for robbery. They seemed to revel in the act, to draw a primal satisfaction from extinguishing a human life. An early account tells of a man named Johnson, whom they encountered on his way to Kentucky. They traveled with him for a day, sharing a campfire, only to murder him in his sleep. They then took his horse and meager possessions and continued on their way, leaving his body for the wolves. One of their signature atrocities gave them a chilling moniker, river pirates. When they killed near a river, they would often disembowel their victim, fill the abdominal cavity with stones and sand, and then sink the body in the water. It was a crude but effective way to hide their crimes, at least for a time. But the river does not keep its secrets forever, and bloated, mutilated bodies began to wash ashore along the rivers of Tennessee and Kentucky, silent testaments to the Harps' passing. The community around Knoxville soon grew suspicious of the hulking, grim-faced men and their terrified female companions. After a local farmer named Thomas Langford accused them of stealing his hogs, they were arrested. But the flimsy frontier jails were no match for the Harps. They escaped, but not before burning down the home of the man who had helped capture them. This act was one of pure spite, a promise of the vengeance they would wreak upon anyone who crossed them. Fleeing Tennessee, the Harps and their captive family moved north into the wilderness of Kentucky. It was here, in the lawless region known as the Barrens, that their reign of terror reached its zenith. They became specters haunting the Wilderness Road, a vital artery for settlers heading west. Every lone traveler, every small family was potential prey. The litany of their victims is a grim roll call of the frontiers forgotten. A peddler named Peyton was found in the woods, his chest split open with a tomahawk. A man named Paca was found floating in a river, his body filled with stones. A traveler from Maryland named Stephen Trabway was killed, his horse and money stolen. The Harps seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, their legend growing with each new disappearance. They briefly found fellowship with other outlaws. For a time, they joined the gang of Samuel Mason, a notorious river pirate who operated along the Ohio River. Mason was a ruthless criminal, but even he was appalled by the Harps. Mason's gang robbed and occasionally killed for profit. The Harps killed for sport. They murdered indiscriminately, their violence drawing too much attention, too much heat. The story goes that Mason witnessed them take a traveler they had just robbed, tie him naked to a horse, and run him through a gauntlet of thorny branches until he was shredded to ribbons, before finally putting him out of his misery. Even for a hardened outlaw like Mason, this was too much. He threw them out of his gang, telling them they were too bloodthirsty even for him. Cast out by their own kind, the Harps resumed their solitary rampage. Their cruelty seemed to escalate. In the summer of 1798, they committed an act that cemented their reputation as monsters. They came across the farm of the aforementioned Thomas Langford, the man who had first accused them in Tennessee. He was not home, but his wife and children were. The Harps slaughtered them all. They then continued on their way and came across a man named John Tully. They killed him and then turned their rage on his young son, a boy of 12, silencing his cries with a knife. A posse was formed, and the Harps were eventually tracked to a cabin near what is now Morganfield, Kentucky. This time they were captured, along with their wives. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The women, Susanna and Betsy, terrified but finally free from their captor's immediate control, began to talk. They recounted a horrifying saga of murder, a continuous trail of bodies left across 2 states. While awaiting trial, the Harps were held in a jail in Russellville. But once again, they proved their uncanny ability to escape. They managed to break free, leaving their wives and children behind. The women were put on trial, but public sentiment was on their side. They were seen as victims, held in bondage by the monstrous Harps. They were acquitted, their testimony providing much of what we know today about the brothers' crimes. Free once more, Big and Little Harp were now fugitives with a price on their heads. But instead of laying low, their rage and bloodlust seemed to intensify. They embarked on a final, desperate killing spree, as if they were waging war on the entire world. They killed a man named Trowbridge simply for the food he was carrying. They killed a young slave boy they encountered on the road. They killed a settler named James Brassel and his entire family. But their final act of depravity was the one that would ultimately bring about their end. In August of 1799, they sought refuge at the cabin of a man named Moses Stegall. Mr. Stegall was away from home, leaving his wife, Marrow, their 4-month-old infant son, and a guest, a Major William Love. The Harps killed Major Love. Then, annoyed by the crying of the baby, Big Harp snatched the infant from its mother's arms and brutally killed him by dashing his head against the stone fireplace. As the horrified mother screamed in anguish, they murdered her as well, her body left beside that of her child. When Moses Stegall returned home to find his family slaughtered, his grief turned into a white-hot fury. He gathered a posse of his neighbors, a group of determined, vengeful men. Among them was a man named John Leeper, whose wife was Marrow Stegall's sister. For Leeper, this was not about law or justice. It was personal. The posse tracked the Harps relentlessly. They caught up with them near the Green River. Little Harp, always the more cunning of the two, managed to escape into the dense woods. But Big Harp was not so lucky. His horse was shot out from under him. He tried to flee on foot, but John Leeper, driven by a cold, righteous anger, took careful aim with his long rifle and fired. The ball struck Big Harp in the back, shattering his spine and bringing the giant crashing to the ground. He was not dead, but paralyzed and helpless. The posse gathered around the fallen monster. What followed was a grim frontier interrogation. As Big Harp lay dying, slowly and in agony, they questioned him. He confessed. With what little strength he had left, he admitted to more than 20 murders, sneering that he was sure there were more he couldn't remember. He showed no remorse, no flicker of regret. He only complained about a peck of trouble they had caused him. As he lay gasping his last breaths, Moses Stegall, the man whose family Harp had destroyed, took out his own long knife. In an act of ultimate frontier justice, he slowly and deliberately sawed off the head of the dying Makaja Harp. The posse carried the grim trophy back with them. To serve as a gruesome warning to all other outlaws, they placed Big Harp's head in the fork of a sycamore tree at a crossroads near what is now Henderson, Kentucky. For years, the decaying head served as a landmark, a macabre totem of justice. The crossroads became known as Harp's Head, and the road is still known by that name today, a permanent scar on the landscape left by America's first serial killer. But the story was not quite over. Wily Little Harp was still at large. He managed to make his way to the lawless settlement of Caven Rock on the Ohio River, the same den of pirates where he and his cousin had been cast out by Samuel Mason. Using the alias John Seton, he ironically rejoined Mason's gang. For a few years, he lived the life of a river pirate, his true identity a secret. The tide turned when the governor put a handsome bounty on Samuel Mason's head. Wily Harp, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. In 1803, along with another gang member, he murdered his leader, Samuel Mason, and cut off his head to claim the reward. He brazenly presented the head to the authorities in Mississippi. But his audacity was his undoing. As he waited to collect his blood money, a man who had been present at the jail in Russellville years before recognized him. He looked at John Seton and saw the unmistakable, malevolent face of wily little Harp. The game was up. Wiley was arrested, tried, and quickly convicted for his role in Mason's murder and for his past crimes as a pirate. In January 1804, he was hanged, and in a final, fitting act of symmetry, his head was also cut off and placed on a pike along the Natchez Trace, another major frontier road. The two Harp brothers, who had lived together in such monstrous union, were now separated by hundreds of miles, their severed heads serving as identical warnings to any who would follow their bloody path. The Harps were not like the Benders, who hid their evil behind a facade of normalcy. The Harps wore their evil openly, like a shroud. They were a force of pure, antisocial rage, a storm of violence that swept across the frontier. Their family was not a conspiracy for profit, but a cult of personality centered on two charismatic and terrifyingly violent men. They declared war on society itself, and in the end, society fought back with the same brutality they had championed. They left behind no home, no orchard, only a trail of bodies and a legend so dark it continues to haunt the backroads of American history. Their story is a chilling exploration of what happens when the bonds of family are twisted not just to prey upon outsiders, but to reject humanity altogether. Case 3. The Sawney Bean Clan Legend. From the raw, resentful fury of the Harps, who declared war on a society that had rejected them, we now journey deeper into the shadows, across an ocean and back in time. We leave the documented facts of the American frontier and descend into the murky depths of folklore, into a story so monstrous it has been whispered in Scotland for centuries. It is a tale that may or may not be true in its particulars, but its power as a legend is undeniable. It speaks to a more primal fear, not just of a family of killers, but of a family that ceased to be part of humanity altogether, creating its own hidden, predatory kingdom. This is the legend of Alexander Sawney Bean and his incestuous, cannibal clan. Our story begins in the late 15th or early 16th century, a time when Scotland was a land of stark contrasts of burgeoning cities and vast, untamed wilderness, of devout faith and deep-rooted superstition. In a small village east of Edinburgh, a boy named Alexander Bean was born. His father was an honest laborer, a ditch digger and hedger, a man who earned his bread through the sweat of his brow. He tried to raise his son to follow the same path, to learn a trade, to become a respectable member of the community. But the young Alexander was possessed by a profound idleness, a deep-seated aversion to honest work that was matched only by a volatile, vicious temper. The very idea of a life spent in toil filled him with a quiet rage. He was a stone in the stream of society, refusing to be carried along by its currents. As he grew into a man, his resentment festered. He saw the world as a thing to be taken from, not contributed to. It was during this time that he found a kindred spirit, a woman who mirrored the darkness in his own soul. Her name was Agnes Douglas, though she was known locally as Black Agnes. She was a figure of fear and suspicion in her own right, accused by her neighbors of witchcraft, of communing with dark spirits and practicing forbidden arts. Whether she was a true witch or simply an outcast who embraced her fearsome reputation, she shared Sawney's contempt for the world and its rules. They were two poles of the same negative charge, and when they met, they did not cancel each other out. They amplified their shared malevolence. They became a pair, their union a pact against the rest of humanity. They quickly realized that their misanthropic nature made life in a structured community impossible. So they fled. They left the relative civilization of the lowlands and journeyed west, towards the rugged, sparsely populated coastline of Galloway. They sought not a home, but a hiding place, a lair where the eyes of the world could not find them. And they found the perfect location. Along a desolate stretch of coast, between the towns of Girvan and Ballantrae, they discovered a deep-sea cave. Today, it is often identified as Benane Cave. It was a geological masterpiece of concealment. The entrance to the cave was set at the base of a high cliff, and at high tide, the churning waters of the North Channel would flood the entrance completely, hiding it from view. Twice a day, the sea itself would seal them off from the world. But behind this aquatic door lay a vast, subterranean world, a network of tunnels and chambers that wound more than a mile deep into the rock. It was dark, damp, and cold, a place no sane person would choose to live. For Sonny and Black Agnes, it was a fortress. It was a kingdom. Here, in the cold, wet darkness, they began their new life. At first, they survived by scavenging, perhaps robbing the occasional lone traveler they could overpower on the winding coastal roads. But their needs were small and the isolation was total. Here, in the belly of the earth, cut off from all law and morality, their family began to grow. Agnes gave birth to a son, then a daughter, then another son and another daughter. They raised their children in the perpetual twilight of the cave, with the roar of the sea as their only lullaby. As the children grew into adolescence and then adults, the family faced a choice. They could send their children out into the world, but that would risk discovery. It would expose their monstrous existence. And so they turned inward. The sons took their sisters as wives. The daughters took their brothers as husbands. Sonny and Agnes themselves continued to procreate. A second generation was born, and then a third, all products of incest. For 25 years, the Bean clan grew in the darkness. They devolved. They became a tribe unto themselves, bound by blood and secrecy. The original pair, Sonny and Agnes, swelled to a clan of 48 souls. 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters. They were a feral, inbred society, knowing nothing of the outside world except that it was a place to be hunted. They had their own language, a guttural mix of grunts and whispers. Their skin grew pale and pasty from the lack of sunlight. Their minds were shaped not by education or faith, but by the singular, brutal reality of their existence. A clan of this size could not survive by scavenging alone. Their early robberies, which had yielded meager supplies, were no longer sufficient. They needed a more reliable source of food. And so, surrounded by the evidence of their violence, the bodies of their victims, they made a final, complete break with humanity. They began to practice cannibalism. It was, in their twisted logic, a pragmatic solution. It eliminated the need to dispose of bodies, a task that always carried the risk of discovery. And it provided a steady supply of meat. The coastal road above their cave became their hunting ground. They worked as a pack, a silent, coordinated unit. Under the cover of darkness, they would lay in ambush for travelers. A small group, a lone rider, a husband and wife fight made no difference. They would swarm their victims, a silent mass of bodies emerging from the gorse and shadows. The attacks were swift and merciless. There was no negotiation, no demand for valuables. There was only the kill. The victims were bludgeoned or stabbed, their struggles quickly silenced. The bodies were then dragged down the cliff face and into the waiting maw of the cave. Inside, the true horror began. The cave became a charnel house, a human slaughterhouse. The clan would fall upon the bodies, butchering them with a practiced, dispassionate efficiency. The clothes were added to a growing pile of stolen garments. The jewelry, coins, and weapons were tossed into a corner, a hoard of useless trinkets in their subterranean world. The flesh was their true prize. Portions were eaten fresh, roasted over a driftwood fire in the deeper chambers of the cave, the smoke filtering out through unseen fissures in the rock above. But they were hunters, and like any predator, they knew the value of preserving a kill. The leftover limbs and organs were carefully dismembered, salted, and pickled, then stored in barrels that lined the cave walls. The legend speaks of a horrifying pantry. Rows of human arms and legs hanging from the rock ceiling like cured hams, next to casks filled with brined viscera. This was their larder, the source of their continued survival. For a quarter of a century, this reign of terror continued, and the region was gripped by a creeping fear. People simply vanished. A merchant on his way to a market, a young couple eloping, a soldier returning home, they would be seen entering the stretch of road along the Galloway coast, and then they would be gone, swallowed by the earth. The disappearances became so frequent that local authorities were baffled. With no bodies and no witnesses, they had nothing to go on. Suspicion fell on the innocent. Local innkeepers were often the last to have seen the missing persons. Many were accused of murdering their guests for profit. Several were arrested, tried on circumstantial evidence, and even executed for crimes they did not commit. The community turned on itself, paranoia and fear poisoning the very air they breathed. All the while, the true culprits slept soundly in their watery fortress, their bellies full, completely unknown and unsuspected. The number of their victims grew into the hundreds. The legend claims that over 1,000 men, women, and children met their end at the hands of the Bean Clan. The clan had become a perfect predatory machine. They were invisible, efficient, and utterly without mercy. They might have continued their ghastly existence indefinitely, a dark secret held by the Scottish coast, had it not been for one mistake. One night they grew careless or perhaps overconfident. They ambushed a husband and wife returning from a nearby fair. The couple was on a single horse, weary but vigilant. The clan swarmed them, perhaps 30 strong, their pale, wild faces a vision from a nightmare. They dragged the woman from the horse before her husband could even draw his weapon. In seconds, a group of the female clan members were upon her, slitting her throat and beginning to disembowel her on the roadside, their hunger overriding their caution. But the husband was not an easy target. He was a former soldier, a man skilled in combat. He wielded a broadsword and carried a pair of pistols. As his wife was being torn apart, a surge of grief and rage gave him a strength he did not know he possessed. He fought back with the fury of a cornered animal. He fired his pistols, dropping 2 of the clansmen. Then, with his sword, he cut a swathe through the attackers, his horse rearing and kicking, creating a small circle of bloody chaos. He was hopelessly outnumbered and knew he would soon be overwhelmed, but he was determined to take as many of the monsters with him as he could. His desperate, furious defense lasted just long enough. As fate would have it, a large group of 20 or more fairgoers were traveling on the same road, not far behind. They heard the gunshots, the screaming, and the clash of steel. Rushing forward, they came upon a scene of unimaginable horror. A lone man fighting for his life against a horde of wild, savage-looking people, while the eviscerated body of his wife lay on the ground. For the first time in 25 years, the Bean Clan was seen. They were exposed. Accustomed to immediate victory and the silence of their victims, the sight of the approaching party of armed men threw them into a panic. They abandoned their attack, grabbing the dismembered pieces of the woman, and scurried back into the darkness, retreating to their cave before the newcomers could fully comprehend what they were witnessing. The husband, bloodied and half-mad with grief, survived. He told his incredible story to the authorities. This time there was a witness. This time there was proof. The tale of a hidden clan of cannibal savages was so shocking that it quickly reached the highest levels of power. Word traveled to Edinburgh and to the ears of King James VI of Scotland, the same King James who would later become James I of England, a man with a noted fascination for witchcraft and the dark arts. The king was not one to dismiss such a tale. He took a personal interest in the matter, determined to purge this evil from his kingdom. He mustered a force of 400 soldiers, a veritable army, and accompanied them to Galloway. With them, they brought dozens of bloodhounds, their keen noses the best hope of tracking the mysterious clan to its lair. The manhunt was the largest the region had ever seen. The king and his men, guided by the surviving husband, began a systematic sweep of the coastline. They scoured every wood, every glen, every shadow. For days, they found nothing. The clan had vanished as completely as their victims. But the bloodhounds were relentless. They kept leading the search party back to the same spot, a barren stretch of beach dominated by a high, imposing cliff. The soldiers were confused. There was nowhere to hide. But as the tide began to recede, the dogs became frantic, barking and clawing at the base of the cliff where a dark, watery opening was slowly being revealed. It was the entrance to the cave. Holding torches aloft, the king and his men cautiously entered. The stench that hit them was immediate and overwhelming, a foul mixture of brine, stale blood, and rotting meat. As they moved deeper, their torchlight illuminated a scene from hell. The main cavern was vast, and it was a gallery of human suffering. To one side was a mound of stolen treasure, piles of watches, rings, swords, and clothes from 1,000 different victims. In another corner, they saw the source of the stench. Human limbs, arms, legs, and torso hung from the rock like slabs of meat in a butcher's shop. Barrels filled with pickled body parts stood in neat rows. The floor was littered with bones, a carpet of human remains crunching under their boots. And then they saw the clan, cowering in the deepest recesses of the cave. Their eyes wide and reflecting the torchlight like animals, were the 47 remaining members of the Bean family. They were pale, filthy, and misshapen from generations of inbreeding. They offered no resistance. They stared back at the soldiers with a mixture of fear and blank, uncomprehending apathy. They were a people for whom this horror was normal. They were captured without a single sword being drawn. The entire clan was bound in chains and marched to Edinburgh. Their crimes were considered so heinous, so far beyond the pale of human behavior, that they were deemed unworthy of a trial. They were not human beings in the eyes of the law. They were beasts to be exterminated. Their judgment was swift and their sentence, designed to be a gruesome reflection of their own atrocities. The execution was a public spectacle. The 27 men of the clan were taken first. One by one, their hands and feet were chopped off. They were then left on the scaffold, forbidden medical aid, to slowly and agonizingly bleed to death, all while the women and children of their clan were forced to watch. The legend says they did not cry out for mercy. They died cursing and spitting at their executioners, unrepentant to the very end. After the last man had bled out, it was the women's turn. The 21 females, from the ancient matriarch Black Agnes down to the youngest granddaughters, were chained to stakes. Great pyres were built around them, and they were burned alive, their screams echoing through the city as a final, terrible end to the legend of Sawney Bean. The story of the Bean clan serves as perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale. It explores the terrifying idea that if a family unit is isolated from society, from its laws, its morals, and its light, it can devolve into something utterly alien. Whether fact or folklore, the legend endures because it touches upon our deepest fears. The fear of the wilderness, the fear of the dark, and the chilling realization that the bonds of family, when twisted, can create a horror more profound and more absolute than any lone killer could ever hope to achieve. The cave on the Galloway coast may be empty now, but the shadow of the family that lived within it still stretches long and cold across the centuries. Case 4. The Kelly Family of Australia. We emerge now from the misty realm of Scottish legend, a story built from fear and folklore, and return to the solid ground of documented history. But the landscape we find is no less harsh, and the family at its center, no less defiant. We travel to the other side of the world, to the sunburnt plains of colonial Australia in the latter half of the 19th century. Here, a family was not born into darkness, but pushed into it. This is not a story of a clan that preyed upon humanity from the shadows, but of a family that felt hunted by society, and in turn, declared a war against it that would forge a nation's most enduring and controversial myth. This is the story of the Kelly family and their son, Ned. Our narrative begins with the very foundation of colonial Australia, the convict system. John Red Kelly, the patriarch, was not a willing immigrant. He was an Irishman from County Tipperary, transported to Van Diemen's Land, what is now Tasmania, in 1841 for the crime of stealing 2 pigs. His crime was one of poverty, his sentence one of exile. After serving his time, he made his way to the colony of Victoria, a free man in a land that would never let him forget his past. It was there he met Ellen Quinn, a woman as tough and resilient as the Australian landscape itself. She came from a large, boisterous Irish clan known for their fierce loyalty to each other and their equally fierce disdain for authority, particularly the police. When Red Kelly married Ellen Quinn in 1850, they were not just starting a family. They were forging an alliance against a world they felt was stacked against them. They were part of a disenfranchised class of poor Irish Catholic settlers, known as selectors, who scratched out a meager living on small plots of land. They were surrounded by squatters, wealthy English Protestant landowners who controlled vast swathes of territory and held most of the political and legal power. Between these two groups were the police, who were often seen by the selectors as little more than the squatters' private army. enforcing a law that favored the rich and punished the poor. Edward Ned Kelly was born into this world of conflict in 1854, the third of 8 children. From his earliest days, he learned that the name Kelly was synonymous with trouble in the eyes of the law. The police harassed his family constantly, often on trumped-up charges of cattle or horse theft, a common accusation used to persecute selectors. Red Kelly was hounded, arrested, and broken by this constant pressure. He died when Ned was just 12 years old, leaving him as the man of the house, a boy forced into manhood with a chip on his shoulder and a deep-seated hatred for the police he blamed for his father's death. But Ned was not merely a product of his resentments. He possessed a fierce intelligence, a natural charisma, and a profound sense of loyalty. A famous story from his childhood illustrates this duality. At the age of 10, he saved another boy from drowning in a creek, an act of selfless bravery for which he was given a green silk sash by the boy's family. He would wear this sash for the rest of his life, even under his armor during his final battle, a symbol of the hero he might have been, hidden beneath the outlaw he became. As a teenager, Ned's path darkened. His family's poverty and the constant police persecution pushed him toward the world of bushranging, the Australian term for life as a highwayman. He was briefly apprenticed to a notorious bushranger named Harry Power, learning the trade of robbery and how to survive in the wild. His criminal record began to grow, a series of arrests for assault and horse theft cementing his reputation with the police. Yet, many of these charges were dubious, and the Kellys always maintained they were victims of a corrupt system. In their world, a horse going missing and ending up in a Kelly paddock was a crime, while a squatter absorbing a selector's land was just business. This perceived injustice was the furnace in which Ned Kelly's rebellion was forged. The point of no return, the single event that transformed the Kellys from petty criminals into the most wanted men in the British Empire, occurred in April of 1878. The incident has become a cornerstone of Australian folklore, its truth obscured by 2 fiercely competing narratives. A young and inexperienced police constable named Alexander Fitzpatrick went to the Kelly homestead to arrest Ned's younger brother, Dan, on a warrant for horse theft. According to Fitzpatrick, he was ambushed. He claimed that Ned Kelly shot him in the wrist, while Ellen Kelly attacked him with a fire shovel, and the rest of the family joined in the assault. He fled, a victim of a violent, lawless clan. The Kelly family's version was starkly different. They claimed Ned was not even there. They said Fitzpatrick was drunk, that he made inappropriate advances toward Ned's teenage sister, Kate, and that in the ensuing scuffle, Dan Kelly merely defended his sister's honor. They swore that Fitzpatrick injured his own wrist on a door latch as he stumbled about, and that he invented the story of the assault to cover up his own misconduct and to exact revenge. Whatever the truth, the law sided with Constable Fitzpatrick. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Ned and Dan Kelly. Ellen Kelly, their mother, was arrested as an accomplice. Despite a petition signed by dozens of neighbors attesting to her good character, she was tried and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, an incredibly harsh sentence for the alleged crime. She was taken away in chains, her infant child torn from her arms. For Ned, this was the final straw. The jailing of his mother on what he saw as a perjured testimony was an unforgivable act of war. He and Dan fled into the rugged Wombat Ranges, taking to the bush. They were soon joined by 2 friends, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. Byrne was intelligent and well-spoken, the gang's lieutenant and scribe. Hart was a young and daring horseman. Together, these 4 young men, their average age barely 20, formed the Kelly gang. They were now outlaws, hunted men. The police of Victoria responded by sending 4 heavily armed officers into the ranges to hunt them down. The police party sergeant Michael Kennedy and constables Thomas Lonigan, Michael Scanlon, and Thomas McIntyre set up a camp at a place called Stringy Bark Creek. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, that they could easily capture or kill the 2 young Kelly boys and their friends. On October 26, 1878, Ned Kelly and his gang discovered the police camp. Believing the police were there to kill them without a trial, they decided to strike first. They approached the camp, where only Lonigan and McIntyre were present, Kennedy and Scanlon having gone down to the creek. Ned called out for them to surrender. According to the sole survivor, Constable McIntyre, Lonigan reached for his pistol and Ned shot him dead. McIntyre, unarmed, surrendered immediately. When Sergeant Kennedy and Constable Scanlon returned to the camp, the gang ambushed them from behind the logs. Chaotic shootout erupted. Scanlon was killed almost instantly. Kennedy, a brave and respected officer, fought back, using his horse for cover before being mortally wounded. According to Ned's later account, he found Kennedy dying and, in an act of what he considered mercy, ended his suffering with a final shot. The events at Stringybark Creek changed everything. The Kelly gang were no longer just outlaws. They were cop killers. The Victorian government passed the Felons Apprehension Act, which officially declared the 4 men outlaws. This meant they could be shot on sight by anyone, citizen or police, with no legal repercussions. A massive reward was placed on their heads. The manhunt became the largest in Australian history. But a strange thing happened. Instead of being universally condemned, the Kelly gang became folk heroes to a large segment of the population. The poor selectors and Irish immigrants saw them not as murderers, but as symbols of defiance against a brutal and oppressive system. They were seen as their boys, fighting their fight. A network of sympathizers emerged, providing the gang with food, shelter, and information, allowing them to elude the police for nearly 2 years. The gang, for their part, leaned into this role. They embarked on a series of audacious bank robberies that were as much about political theater as they were about money. In December 1878, they rode into the town of Euroa. They didn't just rob the bank. They took over the entire town. They held more than 20 people hostage at a local station, but they treated them with courtesy, sharing drinks and stories. Ned charmed his captives, explaining his motives and railing against the injustices of the government and the police. 2 months later, they repeated the performance on an even grander scale in the town of Jerilderie, across the border in New South Wales. They locked the local police in their own cells, dressed in their uniforms, and held the town for 3 days. They robbed the bank, but more importantly, Ned tried to have a long letter published by the local newspaper editor. This document, now known as the Jerilderie Letter, is one of the most remarkable artifacts in Australian history. It is an 8,000-word manifesto, a raw, passionate, and often rambling justification of Ned's life and crimes. Dictated by Ned to Joe Byrne, it is his life story, his declaration of war, and his plea for justice all rolled into one. He details the long history of police persecution against his family, defends his actions at Stringybark Creek as self-defense, and calls for a Republican uprising against the colonial government. He writes, "I have been wronged, and my mother and 4 or 5 men lagged innocent, and is my brothers and sisters and my mother not to be pitied also, who has no alternative only to put up with the brutal and cowardly conduct of a parcel of big ugly fat-necked wombat-headed big-bellied magpie-legged narrow-hipped splaw-footed sons of Irish bailiffs or English landlords, which is better known as officers of justice or Victorian police?" The letter was never published in his lifetime, but it reveals the mind of a man who saw himself not as a common criminal, but as a revolutionary leader, a reluctant general in a class war. For almost 2 years, the Kelly gang ran circles around the hundreds of police and trackers sent to find them. But the net was tightening. Their sympathizers were being arrested and intimidated. The gang was growing weary of life on the run. Ned knew they needed to force a final confrontation, a decisive battle that would either spark the uprising he dreamed of or end in their deaths. This led to the final, iconic act of the Kelly saga, the siege at Glenrowan. In June of 1880, Ned devised a desperate, audacious plan. The gang murdered Aaron Sherritt, a friend they believed had turned police informant. They knew this would cause the authorities in Melbourne to send a special train full of police and trackers to the region. The gang's plan was to derail this train, ambush the surviving officers, and, with the police force of Victoria effectively crippled, ride to the nearby towns and trigger a full-scale insurrection among the selectors. To prepare for this final battle, the gang had spent months forging suits of armor from the thick iron of farmers' plowshares. Each suit consisted of a helmet, breastplate, and backplate, and weighed nearly 100 pounds. It was a crude, medieval solution to a modern problem, a testament to their ingenuity, their desperation, and their desire to become invincible, to transform themselves from mere flesh and blood into symbols of iron-willed defiance. They rode into the small railway town of Glenrowan, taking more than 60 of the town's residents hostage in the local inn. They tore up the railway track at a sharp bend and waited for the police train. But their plan was foiled by one of their own hostages. The local schoolmaster, Thomas Curnow, whom Ned had released, managed to get word to the approaching train, flagging it down just before it reached the broken tracks. Instead of an ambush, the Kelly gang found themselves in a siege. The police surrounded the Glenrowan Inn, and a ferocious, all-night gun battle began. The bullets of the police pinged uselessly off the armor of the gang members as they fired back from the windows of the wooden hotel. Inside, the scene was one of terror and chaos, with hostages caught in the crossfire. As the night wore on, the gang's fate was sealed. Joe Byrne, standing at the bar for a drink, was struck by a stray bullet in the groin and bled to death on the floor. In the early hours of the morning, with the inn riddled with bullets, the police set it on fire to flush out the remaining outlaws. It is believed that Dan Kelly and Steve Hart, perhaps already dead or choosing to die on their own terms, perished in the inferno. Their charred remains were found later, huddled together in a back room. But Ned was not in the inn. He had slipped out during the night, wounded but determined to flank the police and break the siege. As dawn broke on June 28, 1880, the police and the remaining hostages witnessed an almost supernatural sight. A figure emerged from the morning mist, clad in a strange, cylindrical helmet and heavy iron armor. It moved with a slow, clanking gait, its pistol firing methodically. Some of the police thought it was a ghost, a bunyip, a mythical creature from Aboriginal folklore. It was Ned Kelly. He made his last stand, walking directly into the police line, his armor deflecting the bullets from his torso and head. For a brief time, he seemed truly invincible. But the armor had a fatal flaw. It did not protect his arms or legs. The police, realizing this, began firing low. A shot shattered his leg, and then another, and the ironclad figure finally crashed to the ground. As the police swarmed him, he is said to have uttered the words that would become a part of the Australian lexicon. Such is life. Ned Kelly survived, but his rebellion was over. He was taken to Melbourne, where he stood trial for the murder of Constable Lonigan at Stringybark Creek. The trial was a formality. The judge, Sir Redmond Barry, was the same judge who had sentenced his mother years before. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Despite a massive public petition for clemency, with over 32,000 signatures, the sentence was carried out. On November 11, 1880, at the Old Melbourne Jail, 25-year-old Ned Kelly was executed. His legacy is a paradox that lies at the heart of the Australian identity. Was he a vicious, cold-blooded murderer, a terrorist who killed policemen and endangered innocent lives? Or was he a folk hero, a brave rebel fighting a noble war against a corrupt and unjust system? The truth, as it often is lost somewhere in the middle. He was both. He was a product of his time, a man shaped by injustice who responded with a violence that ultimately consumed him. The Kelly family was not a clan of cannibals hiding from the world, nor a calculating ring of prairie predators. They were a family pushed to the edge, who chose to fight rather than submit, and in doing so, created a legend of defiance, of blood, and of iron that continues to captivate and divide a nation to this day. From the lonely inns of Kansas to the lawless roads of the frontier, from the mythical caves of Scotland to the sunburnt plains of Australia, we have seen how the sacred bonds of family can be twisted into something fearsome. Whether driven by greed, rage, or a sense of profound injustice, these bloodlines remind us that the greatest horrors are often born in the one place we are meant to feel safest, the home. Thank you for joining us in the quiet corners of the Crime Folio. May your homes be a sanctuary, and your families a source of strength, not of terror. Sleep well. Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. It is a quiet pleasure to have you with us again as we prepare to explore the intricate architecture of the human lie. Tonight, We delve into the world of the master illusionist, the architect of deceit whose only true capital is audacity. We will examine the lives of those who built empires on nothing more than a convincing story, crafting fortunes from thin air and leaving behind a wake of shattered trust and financial ruin. These are not simple liars. They are artists of the grift, and their stories reveal a profound and unsettling truth about our own willingness to believe. Case 1. The Frank Abagnale Jr. story. Catch me if you can. The story, as it has been told and sold for decades, begins not with a grand scheme, but with a quiet fracture in a young boy's world. In the manicured suburbs of New Rochelle, New York, in the late 1950s, a young Frank William Abagnale Jr. idolized his father. Frank Sr. was a man of charm and local standing, a businessman and a community figure who seemed to command respect effortlessly. To his son, he was a giant, a testament to the power of presentation and confidence. But this idyllic facade was fragile. Frank Sr.'s business ventures began to falter, financial pressures mounted, and the once unshakable foundation of the Abagnale family crumbled. The pivotal moment, the one that would forever alter the trajectory of Frank Jr.'s life, came in a sterile family courtroom. He was 16. The judge, with cold finality, forced him to choose which parent he would live with following their divorce. It was a cruel and impossible choice for a boy who had only ever known a unified home. Overwhelmed, feeling the floor drop out from beneath him, Frank did the only thing that made sense to his fractured teenage mind. He ran. He ran from the courtroom, from the choice, from the life that had been shattered. In that moment of flight, a new Frank Abagnale was born, one untethered to family, to home, to any single verifiable identity. He was a ghost in the making. His first forays into deception were born of simple necessity. Alone in New York City with little money, he quickly discovered that his youthful appearance was a liability. He looked younger than his 16 years, which meant low-wage, menial jobs. He needed a way to alter perception. He lied about his age, adding a decade to his life on paper, a simple act of forgery that opened a door to a new reality. But his first true con, the one that gave him a taste of the power he could wield, was a small-scale grift against the man he once idolized. His father, in an act of kindness, had given him a gas credit card to help him commute to a part-time job. Frank saw not a tool for convenience, but an instrument of opportunity. He devised a simple, clever scheme. He would use the card at gas stations, charging tires, batteries, and other accessories. He would then persuade the attendant to give him a portion of the sales value back in cash. The attendant got a sale and Frank got cash. The only loser was his father, who was left with the bill. When the debt spiraled into the thousands, the fantasy ended. It was a betrayal born of desperation, but it taught him a fundamental lesson. People could be talked into almost anything if you presented yourself with enough confidence. The world of petty fraud, however, was too small for his burgeoning ambition. He observed the world around him with a preternatural eye for its systems, its uniforms, its symbols of authority. And no symbol was more powerful, more universally respected in the jet age of the 1960s, than that of an airline pilot. Pilots were figures of glamour and trust. They moved through the world with an air of effortless command, their crisp uniforms a passport to admiration and access. They were given professional courtesy, their checks were cashed without question, and they could travel the globe for free. Frank decided he would not just admire them, he would become one. The transformation into Frank Williams, a first officer for Pan American World Airways, was a masterclass in social engineering. It began not with a grand forgery, but with a simple phone call. Posing as a high school student writing a report on the airline industry, he called Pan Am's corporate offices and arranged an interview with the public relations officer. He learned about routes, jargon, and the daily life of a pilot. Then, with another piece of audacious misdirection, he called the company that supplied Pan Am's uniforms. He claimed he was a pilot who had lost his uniform while it was being cleaned at his hotel and needed an immediate replacement. By providing a fake employee number and an address for delivery, the uniform was his. The final piece was the FAA license and a Pan Am ID card. For these, he turned to his growing skills in forgery. He obtained a genuine license, used hobbyist model airplane decals and transfer letters to alter it, and created a surprisingly convincing ID. At the age of 17, Frank Abagnale Jr., the high school runaway, had vanished. In his place stood a handsome, confident Pan Am pilot. The world opened up to him. For 2 years, he lived a life most could only dream of. He deadheaded the industry term for flying for free in the cockpits jump-seat in Pan Am flights all over the world. He is said to have flown over 1 million miles, visiting 26 countries. He stayed in the finest hotels, dined at the best restaurants, and was surrounded by beautiful women, all on the airline's dime. The uniform was his shield and his key. It deflected all suspicion. Who would question a pilot? His financial needs were met by perfecting his check-forging schemes. He understood the banking system's vulnerabilities with an intuitive genius. He noticed that the crucial routing numbers at the bottom of a check were printed in magnetic ink. He realized that if he could get his hands on blank checks, he could print his own account number on them. Then, he would deposit them into an account at a new bank and, before the fraudulent checks from a distant bank could bounce, he would withdraw the clean cash and disappear. He pioneered other methods, too. He would print near-perfect replicas of payroll checks, using his knowledge of printing and graphic design. He once visited a bank, claiming to be a security expert, and learned all about their check-cashing procedures. He then used this inside knowledge to create a system that was virtually foolproof for a time. He was an artist, and the banking system was his canvas. But the life of a con artist is a life of perpetual motion. To stay still is to be caught. The pilot persona, for all its glamour, was attracting attention. The real Pan Am was becoming aware of a phantom pilot cashing bad checks across the country. And the FBI was beginning to build a file. The name on that file was Frank Abagnale Jr. Leading the chase was a dogged, no-nonsense agent named Joseph Shea, who would become the inspiration for the character of Carl Hanratty in the later dramatizations of the story. Shea was Frank's opposite. A man of rules, of procedure, of unwavering dedication to the system that Frank so gleefully exploited. A slow, methodical cat-and-mouse game began, played out across the United States. Sensing the net tightening, Frank decided to ground himself. He needed a new identity, one that was less conspicuous, more stationary. He settled in an apartment complex in Georgia and, on his application, impulsively listed his former occupation as doctor. The lie, once spoken, took on a life of its own. He befriended a real doctor in the building, who, impressed by his apparent knowledge, gleaned from medical journals and conversations, offered him a position as a resident supervisor at a local hospital. And so, Frank Abagnale became Dr. Frank Connors, the chief resident pediatrician. The imposture was terrifyingly successful. His role was largely administrative, which shielded him from most life-or-death medical decisions. He would let his team of interns and residents handle the actual diagnoses and treatments, using his authority and charm to bluff his way through rounds. He was an actor playing the part of a doctor, and the hospital was his stage. But the performance was a constant, high-wire act over a chasm of deadly ignorance. The mask nearly slipped in a moment of genuine crisis. An infant, deprived of oxygen, was turning blue. The nurses, in a panic, looked to Dr. Connors for direction. He froze. He had no idea what to do. The cold reality of his deception hit him with the force of a physical blow. He understood in that moment that his games could have fatal consequences. Shaken, he realized he could not continue. The medical career of Dr. Frank Connors lasted less than a year. He quietly walked away before his luck, or a patient's life, ran out. From medicine, he pivoted to law. This was perhaps his most audacious impersonation, as it required not just a convincing performance but a degree of legitimate knowledge. After moving to Louisiana, he claimed to be a Harvard Law School graduate. To back up the claim, he actually studied and, on his third attempt, passed the Louisiana bar exam. He explained later that the state allowed you to take the exam as many times as needed, and that you could pass by elimination. For nearly a year, he worked in the state attorney general's office as Robert Black. Here, for the first time, he seemed to find a semblance of a normal life. He fell in love with a woman and became engaged. The prospect of a real future, a real family, was tantalizingly close. But the lie was a jealous master. His fiancée's father, a legitimate and respected lawyer, would often ask pointed questions about Harvard, questions Frank could not answer. And a colleague in the Attorney General's office, a true Harvard graduate, grew suspicious of his evasiveness. The walls were closing in again. The past, which he had tried to outrun, was catching up. One day, knowing his exposure was imminent, he confessed the truth to his fiancée, hoping for understanding. But the foundation of their relationship was a fraud, and it could not bear the weight of the truth. He left her, and he left the law, once again becoming a ghost. Throughout all these transformations, his check fraud operation had become more sophisticated and vastly more profitable. He was a phantom, leaving a trail of paper worth millions of dollars. He was on the FBI's most wanted list. The agent, Joseph Shea, was relentless. He was a bloodhound on a cold trail, piecing together sightings, tracking the movement of bad checks, slowly building a profile of his elusive quarry. There were near misses. Once, Shea tracked him to a hotel room. Frank, opening the door and seeing the agents, had the presence of mind to feign ignorance, flash a wallet showing the ID of a Secret Service agent, and claim he had just missed his suspect. The ruse worked. He walked calmly past the very men sent to arrest him. There was a strange intimacy to their chase. Frank, profoundly lonely despite his glamorous life, began calling Shea every year on Christmas Eve. It was a taunt, but it was also a cry for connection. He was a boy talking to the only father figure. He had left the man whose entire professional life was dedicated to putting him behind bars. Shea, for his part, began to develop a grudging respect for the young man's ingenuity, even as he grew more determined to catch him. The end of the line came not in America, but in Montpellier, France. An Air France flight attendant, a woman Frank had once dated, recognized his face on an international wanted poster and alerted the authorities. French police, less susceptible to his American charm, descended on him in a grocery store. There was no clever escape, no fast-talking ruse. The game was over. Frank Abagnale Jr., at the age of 21, was finally caught. The consequences were severe. He was sentenced to a year in the French prison in Perpignan medieval fortress, where he was kept in a small, dark, stone cell, naked, with no toilet and no blanket. The conditions were brutal and dehumanizing. After serving half his sentence, he was extradited to Sweden, where he was treated far more humanely but was still a prisoner. Finally, he was deported back to the United States to face the full weight of the American justice system. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. But even then, the story was not over. In a final, legendary act of escape, he managed to trick his guards while the plane deporting him was taxiing on the runway at JFK Airport. He slipped away into the night, making it as far as Washington, D.C. before being recaptured. It was his last flight as a free man. In federal prison, the story took its most unexpected turn. The U.S. government, realizing the unique genius they had in their custody, made him an offer. He could serve the remainder of his sentence, or he could be released on the condition that he work without pay for the FBI. He would help the very agency that had hunted him for years, teaching them how to catch forgers and fraudsters. He would use his powers for good. Frank accepted. Upon his release, Frank Abagnale Jr. began the long, difficult process of building a legitimate life. He tried various jobs, but his criminal record was a constant obstacle. The story goes that he finally approached a bank, the very institution he had once defrauded, and made them a pitch. He offered to give a presentation to their staff on bank fraud. If they found it unhelpful, they owed him nothing. If they found it valuable, they would pay him $500 and tell other banks about him. It was the beginning of his final and most successful career, a world-renowned security consultant. The young man who had built a life on lies now made an honest living teaching others how to detect them. The master forger who had stolen millions now designed secure checks for the largest corporations. It is a perfect story of redemption. a tale of a prodigal son returning to the fold, his talents repurposed for the benefit of society. Yet, in recent years, a new layer of questioning has emerged. Journalists and investigators have scrutinized his claims, finding little to no evidence for some of his most dramatic exploits, like the pilot and doctor impersonations. They suggest that the charismatic con man's greatest con may have been the story of his own carefully curated, highly exaggerated narrative that he sold to the world through his book and countless public appearances. Is Frank Abagnale Jr. the reformed criminal genius? Or is he still the master storyteller, crafting a final, enduring illusion? Perhaps the truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in the murky space between the legend and the reality. His story forces us to confront a disquieting thought. The most profitable lie isn't the one that steals your money, but the one that captures your imagination. Case 2. The Bernie Madoff Ponzi Scheme. From the vibrant, almost whimsical deceptions of a young runaway, we turn now to a deception of a different order. This is not a story of charming impersonation or clever, small-scale forgeries. This is a story of an institution, an icon, and a lie so colossal it warped the very fabric of the financial world for decades. It is the story of Bernard L. Madoff, a name that was once a synonym for stability, and is now a permanent monument to greed and betrayal. Where Frank Abagnale created the illusion of being a single, powerful man, Bernie Madoff created the illusion of an infallible system, a financial god who could command the markets to do his bidding. The legend of Bernie Madoff began long before the fall. It was forged in the crucible of Wall Street in the 1960s. He founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC with a few $1,000s earned from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. From these humble beginnings, he rose to become a titan of the industry. He was not just a player, he was a pioneer. Madoff's firm was at the forefront of the technological revolution that transformed stock trading, helping to develop the electronic platform that would become the NASDAQ. He served as its non-executive chairman, a position that bestowed upon him an almost regal air of legitimacy. His market-making business, the public face of his company located on the 19th floor of Manhattan's Lipstick Building, was real, profitable, and highly respected. It was the engine of his credibility, the solid, unimpeachable foundation upon which he would build his great and terrible lie. The lie lived on a different floor. It lived on the 17th floor. While the 19th floor was the state-of-the-art trading operation, the 17th floor was something else entirely. It was home to Madoff's investment advisory business, a separate, secretive wing of his empire. To be invited to invest here was to be chosen. It was not a fund you could simply find in a prospectus. It was a club you had to be brought into. The clientele was a curated list of the wealthy and the powerful. Movie directors like Steven Spielberg, actors like Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick, baseball legends like Sandy Koufax. But it also extended to major banks, hedge funds, universities, and, most poignantly, major Jewish charities and foundations, including Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel's Foundation for Humanity. Madoff, himself a prominent figure in Jewish philanthropy, cultivated this network with meticulous care. To invest with Bernie was a status symbol, a sign that you were on the inside. The allure was not explosive, unbelievable gains. That would have been too crude, too suspicious. The genius of Madoff's promise was its consistency. In a volatile market that soared and crashed with unnerving frequency, Madoff's fund delivered steady, solid returns, typically between 10 and 12% a year, month after month, year after year. There were no down years. There were barely any down months. He was a rock in a stormy sea, a bastion of certainty in a world of risk. He told his investors he was achieving this through a complex but plausible-sounding strategy called a split-strike conversion. He claimed to be buying a basket of blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options contracts. The jargon was dense enough to sound sophisticated, and his own reputation was powerful enough to discourage deep questioning. Why would you question a financial oracle? You simply handed over your money, received your pristine monthly statements showing steady growth, and felt grateful for your good fortune. This air of exclusivity was amplified by a global network of feeder funds. These were separate investment firms, managed by individuals who had Madoff's trust, whose primary purpose was to gather money from other wealthy clients and funnel it into Madoff's fund. Firms like Fairfield Greenwich Group, run by Walter Noel, and Ascot Partners, run by J. Ezra Merkin, acted as gatekeepers. They charged their own hefty fees simply for the privilege of giving their clients access to Madoff. This created another layer of insulation and legitimacy. If all these smart, successful money managers trusted Madoff, he must be legitimate. The social proof was overwhelming. The machine grew, pulling in money from Palm Beach country clubs, from European aristocracy, from pension funds and family fortunes. It grew into a financial black hole, drawing in capital from all corners of the globe. The reality, the secret of the 17th floor, was one of shocking, almost elegant simplicity. There was no split-strike conversion strategy. There were no trades. There was no investing at all. The billions of dollars that flowed into the investment advisory arm were simply deposited into a single business checking account at J.P. Morgan Chase. That was it. The entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise was a classic Ponzi scheme, the largest in history. The steady returns that investors saw on their statements were simply other people's money. When a client wanted to withdraw funds, Madoff paid them with the principal from new or existing investors. As long as more money was coming in than was going out, the illusion could be maintained indefinitely. The engine room of this fraud was not a high-tech command center, but a deliberately antiquated back office, managed by a small, fiercely loyal group of employees. At the heart of it was Frank DePascali, a man from Queens with no formal financial education who had been with Madoff since the 1970s. DePascali was the chief architect of the fake records. He, along with a handful of others like Annette Bongiorno and Joan Krupi, would orchestrate the creation of an entirely fabricated reality. Their process was a kind of retroactive fiction. At the end of a day, they would look up the historical closing prices of stocks from newspapers or archives. Then they would invent trades, picking stocks that had performed well and creating records to show that Madoff's fund had bought them at a low point and sold them at a high. They generated thousands of fake trade confirmations, printed on old-fashioned dot matrix printers to give them a veneer of authenticity. The computer system they used, an ancient IBM AS/400, was a relic chosen specifically because its data was opaque and difficult for modern auditors to analyze. The 17th floor was a Potemkin village, a stage set designed to fool the world. And for decades it worked. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the very body meant to police Wall Street, investigated Madoff and his firm at least 6 times over 16 years. Each time they came away empty-handed. Madoff was a master of the regulatory audit. He would be tipped off in advance, giving DePascali and his team time to fabricate whatever documents the SEC was asking for. Madoff would then use his immense reputation and charm to disarm the investigators. He treated them with a kind of bemused condescension, as if their questions were a minor annoyance, a distraction from his important work. He was the former chairman of the NASDAQ, they were junior accountants. The power dynamic was entirely in his favor, and they repeatedly failed to look behind the curtain. But there was one man who was not fooled. A Boston-based financial analyst named Harry Markopolos. As early as 1999, Markopolos' firm asked him to reverse-engineer Madoff's strategy to see if they could replicate it. After 5 minutes of looking at the returns, Markopolos knew it was impossible. After 4 hours of mathematical analysis, he knew it was a fraud. The numbers didn't lie. For one, Madoff's return stream showed a smooth, upward-sloping 45-degree angle, something that simply does not exist in the real world of finance. There was no volatility. Furthermore, for his split-strike strategy to work on the scale he claimed, he would have had to be trading a volume of options contracts far larger than the entire listed options market on the Chicago Board Options Exchange. It was a mathematical and logistical impossibility. Markopolos began a lonely, 9-year crusade to expose Madoff. He compiled his findings into a detailed, damning report titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He submitted it to the SEC again and again in 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007. He laid out the evidence with forensic precision, providing 29 clear red flags. He practically gave them a roadmap to the crime. And each time he was ignored. The SEC was understaffed, overwhelmed, and perhaps institutionally incapable of believing that one of Wall Street's own elder statesmen could be a common crook. To Markopoulos, who grew increasingly fearful for his own safety, it was a profound failure of the system itself. The watchdogs were asleep. The end did not come from a regulator or a whistleblower. It came from the implacable force of the market itself. In the autumn of 2008, the global financial system went into cardiac arrest. The collapse of Lehman Brothers sent a wave of panic across the world. Credit markets froze, stock values plummeted, and investors everywhere scrambled for cash. For Madoff, this was the perfect storm he could not weather. His investors, panicked like everyone else, began requesting redemptions. Not for small amounts, but for vast sums. They wanted their money back. And suddenly, the requests were coming in faster than the new investments. The feeder funds needed to withdraw billions. The equation that had sustained the Ponzi scheme for so long was finally inverting. There was more money going out than coming in. By the first week of December 2008, Madoff was facing redemption requests totaling some $7 billion. But the Chase bank account, the wellspring from which all the profits had flowed, held only a few hundred million. The machine was out of fuel. The lie had reached its mathematical limit. There was no way to invent the money. There was nowhere to hide. On December 9th, at the firm's office, Bernie Madoff told Frank DePascali that it was over. The following day, he sat down with his two sons, Mark and Andrew, in his Manhattan penthouse apartment. Both sons worked on the legitimate 19th floor of the business and had been, by all accounts, kept completely in the dark about the fraud on the 17th floor. They had come to him to discuss the early distribution of employee bonuses. Bernie, looking frail and defeated, told them there was no money for bonuses. He then confessed everything. He told them the investment advisory business was a fraud. One big lie. He explained that it was a Ponzi scheme and that he was finished. He estimated the losses at around $50 billion. Mark and Andrew were stunned into silence, then overcome with horror and betrayal. Their father, the man they had worked for their entire adult lives, the Wall Street icon, was a criminal. His legacy and their own was destroyed in an instant. They had spent their lives in the shadow of this great man, only to discover the man was a myth and the shadow was a stain. After absorbing the initial shock, they left the apartment, consulted a lawyer, and did the only thing they could. The next morning, on December 11, 2008, their lawyer contacted the federal authorities. FBI agents arrived at Madoff's penthouse. He knew why they were there. He was calm, cooperative, and reportedly told them, "There is no innocent explanation." Bernard Madoff was arrested, wearing a bathrobe and slippers. The fallout was a global cataclysm. The number that emerged was even larger than Madoff had confessed. The fabricated statements showed a total value of nearly $65 billion. Of that, about $18 billion was real investor principal that had been lost forever. The victims were everywhere. The life savings of retirees in Florida vanished overnight. The endowments of charitable foundations that fed the hungry and cared for the sick were wiped out. Elie Wiesel's foundation lost everything. Families were torn apart. The story became a litany of human tragedy. Some victims lost their homes, others their health. The psychological toll was immense. The sense of betrayal was profound, especially for those in the Jewish community who had trusted Madoff as one of their own. In the years that followed, the human cost would continue to mount in the most devastating ways. Exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff, hounded by lawsuits and the press and unable to escape the shame of his name, took his own life. Andrew Madoff would die of cancer 4 years later, blaming the stress of the scandal for its return. Bernie Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. He never went to trial. In court, he read a prepared statement, claiming he was deeply sorry and ashamed. But to many, the apology rang hollow, a final, unconvincing performance. He insisted he had acted alone, a claim that was widely disbelieved and later proven false as prosecutors secured convictions against Abagnale and more than a dozen other employees. The judge, calling the crimes extraordinarily evil, sentenced him to the maximum possible term, 150 years in federal prison. It was a message that he would die behind bars. The Madoff story is more than a tale of a single monstrous fraud. It is a parable about the intoxicating power of reputation, the dangers of blind faith, and the collective delusion that can grip even the most sophisticated minds when the promise of easy, endless wealth is dangled before them. Madoff didn't just sell a lie about returns. He sold a lie about certainty in an uncertain world. And for that, people were willing to pay the ultimate price. Case 3. The Clark-Rockefeller Deception. The lie of Bernard Madoff was a thing of grand, impersonal scale. It was a cancer on the global financial system, a mathematical monstrosity that consumed fortunes with cold, algorithmic efficiency. This horror lay in its breadth. But there is another kind of deception, one far more intimate and, in its own way, more profoundly disturbing. It is the lie that does not just seek your money, but seeks to inhabit your life, to sit at your dinner table, to father your child. It is the lie of a hollow man, a phantom who builds a life not out of stolen capital, but out of stolen identities. This is the story of a man who called himself Clark Rockefeller, and the darkness that lay behind the famous, borrowed name. To the Boston elite in the 1990s and early 2000s, Clark Rockefeller was an enigma, a delightful and eccentric fixture of the upper crust. He was fabulously wealthy but strangely frugal. He spoke with a peculiar, unplaceable accent that hinted at an old-world, patrician upbringing. He was intelligent, capable of holding forth on subjects ranging from theoretical physics to modern art, yet he possessed no driver's license and seemed baffled by common technology. He was a member of the most exclusive social clubs, yet he had no verifiable family, no childhood friends, no past that anyone could quite pin down. He explained these oddities away with a wave of his hand and a cryptic reference to the family, a shadowy, powerful entity that demanded discretion. The name Rockefeller was his shield. It answered all questions before they were even asked. Who would dare to pry into the private life of an heir to one of America's great industrial dynasties? His wife was the perfect complement to his aristocratic strangeness. Sandra Boss was a woman of tangible, brilliant achievement. A Stanford graduate with a Harvard MBA, she was a high-flying partner at the prestigious consulting firm McKinsey & Company, earning a 7-figure salary. She was the pragmatist, the provider, the anchor that allowed her husband to float freely in his world of esoteric interests and social engagements. He managed their art collection and raised their beloved daughter, Rye, whom he nicknamed Snooks. To the outside world, they were an odd but compelling couple, the high-powered executive and her mysterious, blue-blooded husband. But inside the walls of their marriage, the mystery was beginning to curdle into suspicion. For 12 years, Sandra had lived with the inconsistencies. Clark claimed to have degrees from Yale and other institutions, but there were no records. He told elaborate, contradictory stories about his youth off being raised by nannies, of parents who died in a car crash, of a childhood spent in mansions across the globe. He controlled their finances with an iron fist, despite her being the sole earner. He was charming but manipulative, intelligent but suffocating. The eccentricities that had once seemed charming now felt like evasions. The man she had married was a collection of stories, and she began to fear there was nothing underneath. Her breaking point came when she decided to do a simple background check for a real estate transaction. She hired a private investigator not to expose a con, but simply to find a legal identity, a paper trail. The investigator returned with a shocking conclusion. Clark Rockefeller did not exist. There was no birth certificate, no social security number, no driver's license, nothing. He was a ghost. The entire foundation of her life, her marriage, her family was built on a name that belonged to someone else. The man she loved was a complete fabrication. The discovery was devastating. Sandra Boss, a woman whose career was built on rigorous analysis and spotting inefficiencies, had been the victim of the most personal and profound deception imaginable. She filed for divorce in 2007. The man calling himself Clark Rockefeller, faced with the collapse of his world, fought bitterly. But without a legal identity, he had no standing. He eventually agreed to a settlement, was granted supervised visitation with his daughter, and was forced to accept that his grand performance was over. Or so it seemed. A con artist, when cornered, does not simply surrender. He changes the game. On a Sunday afternoon in July 2008, during one of his supervised visits on a Boston street, he executed a desperate final gambit. As the social worker's back was turned, he shoved her to the ground, bundled his 7-year-old daughter into a waiting car, and vanished. The kidnapping of Ry Rockefeller became national news. The name Clark Rockefeller was broadcast across every television network and printed in every newspaper. This was the act that would ultimately destroy him. His greatest asset, the famous name, had now become his greatest liability. The real Rockefeller family immediately issued a statement. They had never heard of this man. He was not a relative. The national spotlight he had so carefully courted on his own terms now became an unforgiving searchlight. The FBI launched a massive manhunt for the kidnapper and his daughter. For 6 days, the nation was captivated by the hunt for the fake Rockefeller. The trail led them to Baltimore. A real estate agent, recognizing the man from the news, tipped off the authorities. At a waterfront apartment, the FBI found him. He had already begun to construct a new life, a new identity. He was now Chip Smith, a single father and aspiring yacht captain. When the agents stormed the apartment, they found little Ry safe and unharmed. The man who had been Clark Rockefeller, who was now trying to be Chip Smith, was arrested. The game was finally truly over. In custody, the last veil was stripped away. Fingerprints, sent through international databases, returned a match. Clark Rockefeller was not an heir, not an artist, not a physicist. He was Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter, a boy from a small, modest village in Bavaria, Germany, who had come to America as a high school exchange student in the late 1970s and simply never left. He was an illegal immigrant who had spent 30 years weaving a tapestry of lies, each identity more audacious than the last. With his true name revealed, investigators began to look backward, to pull at the threads of his past. And as they did, a far darker story than simple fraud began to emerge. The kidnapping, which had seemed like the climax of his story, was merely the prologue to a murder investigation. The trail led them back to 1985, to the wealthy, sun-drenched town of San Marino, California. There, a young Christian Gerhartsreiter, then in his early 20s, was living under a different name, Christopher Crowe. He told people he was a film student, a relation of the famous director Cameron Crowe. He was charming his way through the local scene, living in the guest house of a woman named Dee Dee Sohus. Dee Dee's adult son, Jonathan, and his wife, Linda, lived in the main house. The three became friends. Then, in February of 1985, Jonathan and Linda Sohus vanished. Christopher Crowe was the last person to see them. He gave conflicting, bizarre stories to their friends and family. He said they had gone to France on a secret mission. He said they had been recruited for government work. No one heard from them again. A few months later, Crowe sold their pickup truck and disappeared himself. The disappearance of the Sohus couple became a lingering local mystery, a cold case that gathered dust for years. The first clue had surfaced 9 years later, in 1994. The new owner of the Sohus property, while digging a hole for a swimming pool in the backyard, unearthed a human skeleton. The body was dismembered and wrapped in plastic bags from the University of Southern California and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, two schools Christopher Crowe had claimed to attend. Forensic science at the time was not advanced enough to make a positive identification, and the prime suspect, the strange man who called himself Crowe, was long gone, a ghost who had dissolved back into the ether. But now, in 2008, that ghost had a name, Christian Gerhartsreiter. The police in California suddenly had their man. The exposure of Clark Rockefeller in Boston was the key that unlocked the San Marino murder mystery. Investigators reopened the cold case with renewed vigor. The bones were re-examined using modern DNA technology, and were positively identified as belonging to Jonathan Sohus. Linda Sohus has never been found. In 2011, after serving his sentence for the kidnapping of his daughter, Christian Gerhartsreiter was extradited to California to stand trial for the murder of Jonathan Sohus. The trial was a surreal spectacle. The man in the defendant's chair was a shell, stripped of all his glamorous personas. He was no longer the eccentric Rockefeller, the erudite Crow. He was just a small, aging man in a prison jumpsuit. The prosecution laid out a powerful circumstantial case. They presented evidence of the plastic bags linking him to the burial site. They brought in witnesses who testified about his strange behavior after the couple disappeared. They painted a picture of a man whose web of lies was threatened by Jonathan Sohus, and who resorted to murder to protect his fraudulent existence. Gerhartsreiter's defense was that he was innocent, that Linda Sohus was the real killer. He maintained his air of detached, intellectual superiority throughout the trial, a final, pathetic performance for the jury. He seemed to view the proceedings as an intellectual puzzle, not a judgment on a brutal crime. The jury was not convinced. They saw through the last desperate charade. In April 2013, Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The story of Christian Gerhartsreiter is a chilling exploration of identity itself. Unlike Madoff, who built a fake system, Gerhartsreiter built fake souls. He was a human vacuum, a man with no apparent core, who could only exist by inhabiting the lives of others. He was a mimic, absorbing the language, mannerisms, and status of the people he wished to be. He charmed intelligent, successful people not because he was a genius, but because he was a flawless mirror, reflecting back their own ambitions and assumptions. They believed he was a Rockefeller because the alternative that he was nothing at all was simply too strange, too unthinkable to contemplate. His life was a monument to a terrifying emptiness. He spent 3 decades becoming other people only to be imprisoned, for the rest of his days, as the one person he had always tried to escape. Himself a murderer from a small German town. Case 4. The Elizabeth Holmes Theranos Scandal. The lies of Frank Abagnale, Bernie Madoff, and Christian Gerhartsreiter were, at their core, parasitic. They fed on existing systems of trust aviation, finance, high society. Our final case tonight examines a different, and perhaps more modern, form of deception. It is the lie of creation. It is the story of a promise not to exploit a system, but to build a new one. A promise to heal the world, wrapped around a core of profound, dangerous deceit. It is the story of Elizabeth Holmes and the hollow empire of Theranos. It began, as all great Silicon Valley myths do, with a vision. In the early 2000s, a 19-year-old Stanford University chemical engineering student named Elizabeth Holmes had an idea she claimed would change the world. Inspired by her own stated fear of needles, she envisioned a future where a full spectrum of blood tests, the very bedrock of diagnostic medicine, could be performed with a single, painless drop of blood pricked from a fingertip. The technology would be housed in a sleek, compact box, small enough to be placed in every home, every pharmacy, every military battlefield. It would democratize healthcare, empower individuals with their own health data, and detect diseases like cancer and diabetes at their earliest stages, saving countless lives. The story was perfect. It was visionary, humane, and incredibly lucrative. In 2003, Holmes dropped out of Stanford to found Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. From the very beginning, the company was built not on technology, but on its founder's persona. Holmes meticulously crafted an image. She adopted a uniform of black turtlenecks, a direct and unmistakable homage to her idol, Steve Jobs. She trained her voice into a deep, unblinking baritone, a vocal affectation designed to command authority. She spoke not in specifics, but in sweeping, revolutionary rhetoric. She was not just a CEO. She was a visionary, a once-in-a-generation mind destined to reshape human history. And Silicon Valley, a culture that fetishizes the myth of the brilliant college dropout founder, believed her. The first investors, like Tim Draper, were captivated by the story and the storyteller. They were investing in the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates, The money poured in. But as the years went on and the company grew, a strange dichotomy emerged. Publicly, Theranos was a rocket ship. It attracted a board of directors that was a who's who of the American establishment. These were not tech or medical experts. They were titans of politics and power. George Shultz, the former Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger, another former Secretary of State. William Perry, a former Secretary of Defense. James Mattis, a future Secretary of Defense. Their presence on the board was a masterstroke of misdirection. They were not there to vet the science. They were there to lend their unimpeachable credibility. If these men, these pillars of the Republic, believed in Elizabeth Holmes, then it must be real. Privately, inside the walls of Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto, a very different reality was taking shape. The company was run with a culture of extreme secrecy and paranoia, orchestrated by Holmes and her secretive partner and company president, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Balwani was the enforcer to Holmes's visionary. He was a man of explosive temper and tyrannical control. Employees were siloed, forbidden from communicating with other departments about their work. Every computer was monitored. Non-disclosure agreements were ubiquitous and ruthlessly enforced. Anyone who questioned the technology or raised concerns was branded a naysayer, a person who was not a team player, and was often summarily fired. The atmosphere was one of pervasive fear. This secrecy served a single critical purpose: to hide the fact that the technology at the heart of the company, the world-changing blood testing device, was a catastrophic failure. The machines, known by names like the Edison or the Minilab, simply did not work. They produced wildly erratic and unreliable results, a cascade of error codes, and failed quality control checks. The fundamental scientific challenge of running dozens of complex assays on a microsample of blood was something the company had never come close to solving. The lie was maintained through a series of elaborate deceptions. When potential investors or corporate partners would visit, they would be shown a carefully staged demonstration. A technician would prick Holmes's finger, take a sample, and insert it into the Edison box. A short while later, a result would appear on a screen. What the visitors didn't know was that the box they were looking at was a dummy. The result was either predetermined or, in some cases, the test was being run in another room on a commercially available third-party analyzer, usually a large machine made by Siemens. To run the tiny finger prick samples on these conventional machines, the blood had to be diluted, a practice that further compromised the integrity of the results, rendering them medically worthless. The deception escalated to a terrifying new level when Theranos signed massive deals to bring its technology to the public. They inked a partnership with Walgreens to install Theranos wellness centers in their stores across Arizona and California. Another deal was made with Safeway, which spent hundreds of millions building clinics in their supermarkets in anticipation of the Theranos revolution. To secure these deals, Holmes and Balwani presented the companies with fraudulent validation reports, documents that falsely claimed their technology was as good as, or better than, traditional lab equipment. They even presented a report that bore the forged logo of the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, implying a stamp of approval that had never been given. The launch in Walgreens stores in 2013 marked the point of no return. The company was now taking blood from real patients and providing them with data that would influence their medical decisions. But they were still using the same broken technology and the same deceptive workarounds. The vast majority of the 200-plus tests on the Theranos menu were not being run on their proprietary Edison machines. They were being run secretly on the standard Siemens machines, using diluted finger prick samples that produced dangerously inaccurate results. Patients were receiving data that suggested they might have cancer when they were healthy, or that their blood sugar was normal when they were diabetic, or that their blood-thinning medication was at a safe level when it was at risk of causing a stroke. The lie was no longer just about investor money. It was a direct threat to public health. Inside the company, the moral burden on the employees who knew the truth was becoming unbearable. One of the most tragic figures in this internal struggle was Ian Gibbons, Theranos' chief scientist. Gibbons was a brilliant biochemist with decades of experience, recruited in the early days. He knew with absolute certainty that the technology was a fraud. He was marginalized by Holmes and Balwani, his warnings ignored. As Theranos prepared to face a patent lawsuit, Gibbons was terrified he would be forced to perjure himself on the stand. Drowning in despair, and knowing the scientific empire he helped build was a house of cards, Ian Gibbons took his own life in May of 2013. But others found the courage to speak out. A young lab employee named Erica Chung, alarmed by the constant quality control failures and the practice of deleting outlier data points to make the results look more consistent, resigned and saved evidence of the malpractice. And then there was Tyler Schultz. Tyler was the grandson of the esteemed board member George Schultz. He took a job at Theranos in 2013, filled with idealism, only to be confronted with the same shocking reality as Chung. He saw the doctored data, the failed tests, the culture of fear. He tried to warn his grandfather, a man he revered. But George Schultz, completely captivated by Holmes's charisma, refused to believe him. He sided with Holmes, telling his own grandson that he was wrong. The confrontation fractured their family. Frustrated and stonewalled, Tyler Schultz took a monumental risk. He contacted a journalist at the Wall Street Journal named John Carreyrou. Carreyrou, a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, began to dig. He connected with Erica Chung and other former employees who, speaking anonymously, confirmed Schultz's story. He pieced together the evidence of the scientific fraud, the rigged demos, and the culture of intimidation. Theranos, learning of the investigation, unleashed its full power. They hired David Boies, one of the most feared and famous litigators in America, to crush the story. Boies' firm engaged in a campaign of surveillance and intimidation against the whistleblowers and against Carreyrou himself, threatening multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Tyler Schultz found himself followed by private investigators and facing immense legal pressure that would have bankrupted his family. George Schultz tried to pressure his grandson into signing a document that would discredit him. Tyler refused. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published John Carreyrou's first explosive article, titled "A Prized Startup Struggles." It laid bare the core of the deception for the world to see. The dam had broken. Holmes's response was one of defiant denial. The very next day, she appeared on CNBC, her voice steady, her stare unwavering. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." It was a final bravura performance, an attempt to frame herself as a persecuted visionary. But the performance could not hold back the flood of reality. Federal regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, descended on the Theranos labs, and their findings were damning. They uncovered unsafe and unsanitary conditions, incompetent staff, and evidence of the inaccurate testing that had endangered patients. They banned Holmes from the blood testing industry for 2 years. Theranos was forced to void 2 years' worth of patient test results, tens of thousands of them. The Walgreens deal collapsed. Lawsuits from investors and patients piled up. By 2018, the company that had once been valued at over $9 billion was worthless. It dissolved, its name now a byword for corporate fraud. The final act played out in a federal courtroom. In 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Their trials were held separately. Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts in July 2022. Holmes's trial was a national spectacle. Her defense team argued that she was a true believer, not a criminal con artist, a failed entrepreneur, not a fraudster. They tried to portray Balwani as a Svengali-like figure who had manipulated her. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. The forged documents, the testimony of the whistleblowers, the emails that showed Holmes knowingly and repeatedly lied to investors, partners, and the public. In January 2022, a jury found Elizabeth Holmes guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. She was later sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. The story of Theranos is a quintessentially 21st century tragedy. It is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of a story, especially in a culture desperate to believe in saviors and technological messiahs. Elizabeth Holmes sold a vision of a better future, and for that vision, she was allowed to bypass the rules of science, business, and ethics. Her lie was not just about money. It was about hope. She preyed upon the universal human desire to live longer, healthier lives, and the willingness to place our faith in those who promise to deliver it. The black turtleneck and the deep voice were not just affectations. They were the costume and script for the greatest and most dangerous role of her life. Tonight, we have journeyed through 4 labyrinthine worlds of deceit. We saw a young man escape a broken home by becoming anyone he wanted to be, a financial titan who built a hollow mountain of trust, a phantom who stole not just money but identities, and a visionary who sold a miracle that was nothing but a lie. Each story, in its own way, holds a mirror to our own vulnerabilities, our respect for authority, our desire for certainty, our awe of genius, and our desperate hope for a better world. The greatest con artists do not just sell a product. They sell a reflection of our own deepest desires. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. May your trust be well placed, and your dreams be built on foundations of truth. Sleep well.